Conscription, or the state-mandated enlistment of men and occasionally women into the armed forces of their country, is clearly a controversial and these days widely unpopular practice. Even still, almost half of all countries on Earth have some type of conscription that ranges in severity from endless forced service to the country's armed forces to highly selective and brief training that can be avoided through tertiary education, other essential services, or even just a nicely worded letter. Either way, no matter how severe it is, that's a lot of countries that reserve the right to potentially put their people into armed conflict by choice or otherwise, and that has very real costs, beyond obviously the most pressing issue of risking people's lives. The world, though it may not feel like it, is living through one of the most peaceful periods in modern history, and in the age of highly advanced mechanised warfare, less than ever a major conflict's going to be decided by how many haphazardly trained conscripts can get thrown onto a battlefield, and that's putting it optimistically. Considering this, it's perhaps surprising that forced military service is still as popular as it is, especially when accounting for the potential economic problems caused by taking young, productive workers out of their early careers or education to mostly just receive training that hopefully they'll never need to use. What's even more surprising is that despite this looking like a complete waste of manpower and resources, a strange pattern emerges when mapping out the countries that still have forced conscription. They are either extremely wealthy, comprising some of the most successful economies in the world like Norway, Switzerland and Singapore, or they're extremely poor, with seemingly very few countries in the global middle class participating in this practice. With a pattern this peculiar surrounding an issue that has the potential to have profound impacts on the lives of the people living in these countries, the logical question is, why? Does giving a population basic military training instill a sense of discipline in them that translates to other areas of the economy? Does it unify a country or act as some kind of stimulus? Or, on the opposite end, is it at least partially responsible for making some of the poorest countries in the world just a little bit poorer? Well, to find out, we must as always answer a few simple questions. Does forcing people into military service have any hidden economic benefits? What really explains this strange statistical pattern? And perhaps more realistically, what are the economic costs of these programs? When looking at a pattern like this, especially when there are only 53 total data points, it's important not to go full literary arts degree and look for meaning where there is none. Anybody that works in any kind of analytical role, especially economists, will know that lying with statistics is easy, and the easiest person to lie to is oneself. So, just because this looks like a trend on this particular chart, it's important to rigorously look for flaws before recommending that every economy should reintroduce the draft. So this tracks how many countries that have some form of mandatory military conscription fall into different economic income levels as measured by GDP per capita. Now, the levels selected here are not completely arbitrary. Less than a $5,000 GDP per capita generally classifies a country as undeveloped, where it will have very real problems with mass poverty. Between that and $10,000 is the very early stages of developing, $10,000 to $30,000 is the global middle class, and a GDP of more than $30,000 per capita is usually indicative of highly advanced economies. Now, getting more granular and dividing these groups into $5,000 tiers or $1,000 tiers will naturally make this trend look more flat, and likewise picking bigger groups will do the opposite. The only way to means test this is to compare the same groupings on this chart with conscription to a chart with the same groups that includes all economies, and that looks like this. It's subtle, but a fair bit closer to the expected pattern, where there are a lot of poor countries and a relatively even handful of others that fall into these different categories. What there isn't is the large spike of wealthy countries like we see in the group of economies with conscription. The other step that's very important to address, but often overlooked, is the reliability of this data. Fortunately here, economies don't really make secrets about their conscription practices, and national GDP figures are compiled fairly rigorously by the World Bank, but especially when looking at economies that might have conscription for the very reason they are in a geopolitically compromised position, this isn't always good enough. North Korea doesn't have reliable economic figures outside of those gleaned by the CIA because the Hermit Kingdom is not letting World Bank representatives poke around their industries, and that very same hostility is why it has conscription. Likewise, Taiwan has military conscription almost entirely because of the looming threat posed by the People's Republic of China that claims the territory as its own. But because international organisations don't want to poke the bear, so to speak, they don't produce economic figures for it because that would be akin to recognising it as its own economy. Eritrea has conscription, but the country is so dangerous and closed off, economic figures haven't been collected there since 2011. The point here is that a lot of countries have military conscription for a reason, and that same reason makes collecting reliable economic data difficult. But with that out of the way, it's still safe to say that there is a pattern here, especially at the top end. A larger than average share of the world's richest economies have military conscription. So, does national service stimulate an economy? For starters, there are some potential budgetary advantages to having a conscription system in a country, especially one that wants to or needs to maintain a powerful military force. By making all citizens, or more often just men, undergo basic training and some form of service, a country can build up a massive potential standing army on a much smaller budget. Once service is done, most of these countries' conscripts can go back to living and working and being productive, tax-paying, child-having, consuming members of society. But if a military conflict broke out, they could be called back and put into action far quicker than if they had to be trained from scratch. It's much easier and cheaper to have a potential army a few million strong by calling back pre-trained conscripts than it is to maintain an army of that same size with volunteers who need to be paid constantly for making that their job. Now, this is of course assuming that the country would eventually need all of that manpower, which hopefully would never happen, but the very fact that a country has a huge military trained population is as much a deterrent as expensive weapon systems. There's also something to be said for the discipline, contacts and skills that can be attained through military service, mandatory or otherwise, especially in advanced economies. The USA, while it doesn't technically have conscription, is a great example of this. The country obviously has a huge military with a lot of personnel cycling through it, and economists found that veteran households consistently earn more money than non-veteran households. Veteran households were also half as likely to fall below the national poverty line. Now, this isn't a perfect comparison because obviously a lot of people join the military in the USA as a way to get a subsidised education. But even accounting for education level, veteran households still come out on top by similar margins. Unfortunately, there's no way to say for sure that forcing everybody into the military will have the same effect because there may be other factors, like people who volunteer for the military just being more motivated and willing to put up with temporary discomfort for long-term gain than the average person their age, even before they get military training. But until a country with conscription lets economists carve out a few million of their citizens to sit out for the sake of science, that's about the best evidence that we have that there may be some intangible economic benefits to military service on an individual level, and by extension, national level. Realistically though, there is a far more simple explanation as to why this pattern exists, and it should hopefully give policymakers some pause before they start touting the economic benefits of forcing people to join the military. The reason that a disproportionate amount of wealthy countries have conscription is simply because they can afford to. Switzerland, Norway, Finland, Sweden and Denmark are realistically in no immediate danger, but they have in many cases centuries-long traditions of military service for all of their men, and they have the national wealth to easily maintain these programs. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore and Cyprus in particular are in slightly more precarious geopolitical situations where they do need to outwardly display that they are capable of military force. They also know that in the event of a conflict, they will get equipment supplied to them from strong global allies, so having a lot of personnel on standby to use all of that equipment when it comes is a decent strategy and more cost effective than maintaining millions of personnel full time. Qatar, the UAE and Kuwait are much the same. They have a lot of national wealth from their huge oil reserves, and geopolitically they're not in the greatest neighbourhood in the world. Beyond that, their citizen populations are actually quite small compared to their total populations, because most of these countries have a high share of working immigrants making up their collective workforce. So if a small share of the population that are actually citizens eligible for conscription go off and play soldier for a few months, it's not going to impact the economy that significantly. These economies are not rich because of conscription, and they're also not rich in spite of conscription. It's just that they can maintain conscription because they are rich. And to do this sustainably, they do need to be rich because, unsurprisingly, military conscription has a long list of crippling economic problems. Of course, this is particularly apparent in some of the poorest countries in the world that in many cases can't even afford to feed their own people, but somehow find enough to maintain a huge standing military. But even in the group of advanced economies, this causes some unexpected issues well beyond just the wasted tax dollars and manpower. South Korea mandates that all men perform at least 18 months of military service by the time they turn 28, and even men with relatively severe disabilities are still expected to do general community service in lieu of any time that they would have spent in training. There are exemptions, but they are really weird. Sports stars, visual artists, classical musicians and dancers may be given exemptions, but conscientious objectors and modern musicians, one of the largest drivers of the country's booming entertainment industry, are famously not exempt. Now, for regular people, South Korea has one of the most competitive job markets in the world. Their university entrance exams are taken so seriously that flights in the country get grounded the day of the test so as to not disturb the children fighting for limited placements in extremely competitive and selective universities that in turn could get them a limited and coveted job in one of the country's highly concentrated conglomerates. Those companies themselves can afford to be so selective with who they employ that after all of that, they run their own exams, and then only the highest performers from all of these tests, studies and qualifications get the chance at interviewing for a basic job. It's a ruthless process with huge consequences. A job at a company like Samsung pays well above the national average, and failing to get a job at any of the major conglomerates is seen as a failure as a person and a waste of years of intense schooling. Now, this by itself is already not great. But with the competition for a job being so fierce and things like promotions being equally competitive, needing to take 2 years off to join the military puts men in the country at a significant disadvantage. In the past, this was addressed by a business point scheme that would give men a small leg up to compensate them for their lost years of service, but this system was abolished because it too was seen as unfair for women who had to compete for jobs with men who got this leg up. When a single percentile rank on a standardised test could mean the difference between a career with one of the mega corporations or working for half the pay somewhere else, finding a system that can provide equality for something as significant as 2 years in the military is almost impossible. Today, the unemployment rate for men out of university is noticeably higher than for women, and that's causing problems in a country that is already facing a lot of threats. The country is almost perfectly politically divided along gender lines, with men leaning more conservative to re-implement the benefits they got from military service and traditional roles they enjoyed in the workforce. It's also pulling massively from the country's birth rate, which is already the lowest in the world for a sovereign country. The ultra-competitive jobs in the country, and men not being able to fill typically expected roles, means that the government, the companies and the military are effectively starving themselves of manpower with their own actions. Now of course, South Korea is just one example, and for that matter, one of the outliers of wealthy countries that maintain conscription. While things are bad there, it's of course significantly worse on the other end of this chart, with the sacrifices made by the poorest countries in the world. Conscription in countries like Niger, Syria, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and perhaps worst of all, Eritrea, are large, inefficient economic burdens on countries whose citizens predominantly live in absolute poverty. But in many ways, the economies of these countries have developed around the necessity for a strong, singular military force because it is an effective tool for legitimising leadership through force in countries that don't have strong democratic systems. Military training in these countries can also be used as a way to make sure that a majority of fighting-age men who could present a revolutionary threat are indoctrinated to fight for their leader. Similarly, it's a way to screen people who might have loyalty to factions that oppose the current government. In countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is one of, if not the poorest economies in the world, conscription was first introduced as a way to integrate dozens of informal militias that existed across the country and would constantly fight with one another into a singular force. Unfortunately, militaries in these countries are more likely to be used against their own people than they are any external threats, so genuine military capability is not as important as just making sure that anybody that could fight is fighting for the team that makes the rules. There really is no economic justification for it, and beyond just being a massive drain on limited resources, these groups often destabilise other legitimate industries that might be trying to take shape in the countries. Eritrea in particular has the most severe conscription practices of any country in the world. People are forced into military service and are often not given permission to retire until they are too old and weak to be of any use. The military uses this huge pool of excess manpower to operate basic industries like construction, education, and even agriculture. While this may sound better than just having a huge military force waiting around until there's something to go and fight, this actually in many ways is worse for the economy because it makes it almost impossible for any regular businesses to operate in a country where they need to compete with an unpaid and involuntary force making the same stuff. Providing national defence is one of the most important things that a national economy can do. Unfortunately, without it, the resources, industries and talent of a country can easily be exploited by a belligerent who did make those investments. But this is a public service like any other, and the way that a country provides it is just as important as the fact that they provided it at all. Conscription is not an efficient or economical mechanism for providing this service, which is probably why only the richest countries that can easily bear this expense and the poorest that simply don't care still have it today. If a country wants a strong military, the best way to get that is to have a strong economy. And if a country wants a strong economy, it's better that its manpower, especially young, highly productive workers, get to use their time where they will be most productive. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.